On today's episode of the show, we have guest coach Charlie Taggart. Charlie is the assistant D-line coach with Wilfrid Laurier Golden Hawks. He's also coaching with the Cambridge Lions in the OPFL. Charlie, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to get on here and just talk a whole bunch of things that you can do with a four-man front and all the advantages that you get out of it and some of the disadvantages that come along with it as well.
Awesome. So if you want to just kind of walk us through, your playing history and your coaching history, I know we met many years ago now, coaching summer football and during your time at Guelph. So what kind of got you to where you are today in your coaching career?
So coaching actually started for me about the same time that playing started. It was the year after I started playing football. I got introduced to a rep team, and then right after that, I went back and started coaching house league football, minor football in Hamilton. And then as I went on to high school, I ended up helping out with the junior team in my senior years, and then eventually helping out with the Hamilton Ironman and the OVFL as an assistant D-line coach. And then from there, I kind of always was around the Team Ontario tryouts, just trying to see what I could learn from other coaches around the league. Um, I ended up going on and playing 5 years at Guelph. Started games in 4 of those 5 seasons. I think I had a pretty darn good freshman year there, and then kind of dealt with injury battles and realized that coaching's probably the path for me. Uh, since then, since I left Guelph, I've been coaching at Laurier as the assistant D-line coach under Coach Ron Van Moorkirk, and it's been an awesome experience. It's been a lot of fun and a lot of knowledge being gained.
Yeah, for sure. I think as I was kind of playing in the league, similar time to when you were playing the league, it's pretty cool to go from that front seven group that you were a part of as a player. In Guelph with Coach Clough and Coach McNeil there. A very creative, challenging front as an offensive lineman, and then to get to work with Coach V. It's a pretty cool combination of people there influencing your young coaching career. So that's awesome. We're super excited to have you on. I'm going to pitch it to Charlie now. He's going to share his screen. He's been putting together a ton of stuff for us on the even front, which for people out there is your four-man front. So we're going to talk front seven play and kind of the different strategies you can use with that four-man front, take away some different things that the offense is trying to do, and then also some considerations you got to make in terms of what are you giving up, or what are the challenges with playing those types of fronts.
Let's get her going then. So basically what I want to do with today is just show how you can defend different run game in a base 4-3, but also start with the basic tools on terminology of how to describe different positions, how to talk alignment and gaps, and understand what leverages give you advantages versus different run game. So to start, I did use some different terminology here because I thought it wouldn't be fair to steal from my former coaches too much or the current ones that I work with. So for the sake of this video, we're going to just go with these techniques here. So everyone knows, you have an A gap, B gap, C gap, A gap between the center guard, B gap between the guard tackle, C gap typically your edge unless there's a fullback or tight end. And then you have here D gap, which would be the outside contain or outside of a fullback or tight end. Now what I have here above are the numbered techniques that you can use for D linemen. So all that really tells us how do you want your D lineman to line up against an offensive lineman, right? So here we have our zero technique, head up on the center, typically used if you're going to do some kind of two gapping or if you're going to do a heavy front with multiple players on or like 3 out of 4 of your D linemen on one side of the ball. Uh, Here we have our one technique. One technique is typically like a nose tackle. He's going to be eating the big double teams versus inside zone between the center and the guard. Very specific for the way that I like defensive line is your one technique needs to shade the guard and not the center, right? Because I'll get into that stuff later. Then we get our two technique, which is head up on the guard, typically used for like a heads up front, or if you're going to be doing two gapping through the guards. Then we get our three technique, which is our traditional B gap defender. He's going to be outside shade on the guard. Typically called a 4-eye. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to call it a 4 technique. Head up on, or inside shade on the tackle. All right, a lot less commonly used in a 4-3, but I have some good clips of how Saskatchewan Roughriders actually used 4 techniques from their D tackles to open up some pass rush lanes. Then we get our 5 tech, which is just head up on the tackle. That way they can eliminate the interior gap or play the outside gap, depending on if it's a run or a pass, so that you don't have to give up your outside leverage on the quarterback. Then we have our 6 technique, which is going to be our traditional edge defender, defensive end. He can be outside shade on the tackle to about 1.5 yards wide, depending on how much you're threatened by outside run game in your league. So first thing I want to go over is just understanding what you want to line up with against what. So typically, offenses, when they run inside zone, are going to try and double up to the middle linebacker. As soon as you put a 3 technique on the field, so here we're in a strong front. I'm going to call this a 6-3, a 1, and a 6, right? Working from field to boundary. If you put that 3 technique on the field side offset from the tailback, it guarantees one thing, and that's that the tailback is going to have to cut back if you stay in your lanes, right? Typically what this does is it actually reduces the area that the running back has, and it forces him to change direction in the backfield before approaching the line of scrimmage, right? Backside, we're going to have our 1 technique. He's going to be responsible for making sure that he stays in his gap and that he doesn't get reached by the backside guard. If we get that, then we get 2 players in 1 gap. And as soon as that happens, then the defense is now at leverage and we're playing down a man essentially. Right? On the backside here, we have the 6 technique, and he's going to be playing like what's called the shuffle technique if the offensive lineman doesn't come to block him. Right? So I'm going to kind of clear this picture up a little bit right here. Okay, same thing. We're calling the field left now. We have a 6, a 3, a 1, and a 6. The linebacker is playing for the other gap. So if this offensive lineman is responsible and you're getting a zone read, he's going down to the will linebacker. This defensive end is going to play a shuffle technique. Now, it's really important that the shuffle technique, you out-leverage the quarterback, right? Because if you don't out-leverage the quarterback in his own run scheme, what ends up happening is he ends up taking off and running, right? Now, a lot of teams put, especially in high school, their most athletic dude at quarterback, right? And it becomes a real issue if you have the most athletic dude on the field running the ball. So I'm just going to share a little clip of what happens when you don't take away the quarterback run game. So I got a 2018 Lamar Jackson clip, right? This is the best dude in the world at doing this QB run stuff. You can see right here, Frank Clark, or not Frank Clark, D Ford ends up squeezing the edge a little bit tight, and he loses his leverage on the quarterback. Well, I hate to say it, defensive lineman, but most of the time, this dude's going to be a better athlete if they're running his own read than you are, right? So it's important that you keep leverage on him, and he can't scamper for free yards. So here we have the tight angle. You'll see, and this is a way that it's coached. I'm not going to agree or disagree with it, but one of the phrases that you'll hear is they're telling this defensive end here to touch the tackle, right? Well, if that tackle gets really good movement like he does, and we squeeze this down, but we try and touch him, we actually lose our leverage on the quarterback, right? Now, it looks like he's got 1 step on him, but with his forward momentum and without any momentum at all, right, he has to move against his weight to try and keep up with Lamar. So again, this is at the highest level. You see the shuffle technique, just playing backside on the zone run game. And you just got to make sure that as the backside defensive end, you maintain your contain, right? So the important thing here is that this run is being forced to cut back, right? So the run here is being forced to cut back because we have this 3 tech defender, That ensures that our linebacker is probably going to be clean, and if he's not, it's going to bounce all the way back to this defensive end. So the other thing you can't do as a defensive end is get up the field, right? And I'm going to go on later to talk about a penetrating defense versus a defensive line that stays at the scrimmage. But for the sake of playing the zone read, I know when I was at Guelph, we used to term it as a 50-50 technique, right? You have the quarterback for 50% and you have the running back for 50%. Because the reason being, if these guys all get really good movement, right, you get this big open vertical seam where the running back gets the ball and he cuts back underneath the defensive end. So we got to make sure that not only are you playing the quarterback and keeping leverage on him, but after you ensure that ball's handed off, you can squeeze down and take away that extra gap, right? Because the important thing to remember is, as a defense, if the quarterback's running the ball, we're always down a guy. There's always going to be an extra gap if the quarterback gives a run threat. So you have to find a way to eliminate both the run threat of the quarterback and play the running back with the free safety high.
And I think that gives, a good piece of context, especially I find coaching summer football, one of the hardest things to do is get those DNs to slow down, right? When they're unblocked, even when they do get, say, a zone or a turnout block from the tackle, there's a benefit to getting on the other side of the line of scrimmage, but getting 3, 4, 5 yards on the other side of the line of scrimmage, there's no benefit to you at that point, right? Unless the ball is right in front of you, right, which is a pretty rare situation, you maintaining that leverage on the quarterback to your gap side responsibility is important. But also, I find a lot of guys, like you just brought up, they'll feel like they're in that position. They know they're supposed to take the quarterback, but then they just get 2, 3 yards upfield, and that's when you see all those missed arm tackles on the cutback from the back.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you do get a lot of it. Well, it's like, well, he was in position to make the play, but he probably took himself just too far out of position, especially if you get an arm tackle and not a body on it. So now what I'm going to go over is like a weak front. So a weak front to me is a 6, a 1 to the field, a 3 to the boundary, and a 6 to the boundary on the defensive end. This is probably not the look that you want if you're defending outside zone, but it doesn't mean it's a bad look, right? It has its advantages versus other plays, and I'm going to go over that in a second. But first I want to address how this has to fit up for inside zone. So it's really important that if you're playing a weak front, you can't let the guards go free, and you can't let the double teams go to where they want, right? Because typically offensive lines they want the leverage player to get off the double team. They never want the backside player of the run, of where the run's headed, to get off the double team, because then it gives the linebacker really good leverage to his gap, right? So what you're going to end up getting here most of the time, if you play a one-tech, is you're going to get a combo right here that's going to go from the tackle to the mat, right? Then we're going to probably get some kind of combo block here that leads, again, up to the will, right? He'll be on the nose. The guard will probably be climbing up to the will. So it's really important that this end doesn't get up the field. He plays at the line of scrimmage, and that this guard stays occupied by this defensive tackle. So what you'll see a lot of the time is once these guys take their initial step this way, sorry, I can't move the center, but once they take their initial step to the zone side, the tackle may be falling and putting his hands on the center. What that allows is the guard to climb directly up, and it ends up creating a very large gap for the tackle to defend on his own. So if you're going to be playing a weak front to inside zone, you have to understand that, one, the defensive lineman has to occupy the guard, whether that be penetrating or whether that be grabbing cloth on him to keep the MAC linebacker free. Two, this run probably isn't going to cut back unless you get a phenomenal fill by your MAC linebacker, right? And I'd say, Jax, you've coached offense for a long time. When you're running inside zone at a weak front, something probably, there's some light bulbs going off saying, hey, this may hit big.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing for us on offense is the ability of that guard to get off that defensive tackle. And, I think it's tough, certainly on film, when you're a high school D lineman, oftentimes you don't have tight film. It's hard for your coaches to really emphasize those little things like, oh, you put your hands on the center versus your hands on the guard here, and that's what made it easier for you to get reached, or made it easier for that guard to work up to the second level. But it's a lot easier for a running back, certainly when you can stay on your aiming point longer. You brought it up in the first one. That three tech towards the direction of the zone, one of the benefits you get out of that is that aiming point. If you're a team that runs zone at the outside hip of the guard, or certainly if you're running any type of off tackle or outside zone, that's going to force the ball up. Hopefully, if your three tech does a good job and stays in this gap, that's going to force the ball really up into that A gap, working back, which makes the rest of your run fit from the defense a little bit simpler. Here there's certainly some advantages. Like I look at some of the big D tackles we've had to defend, and if you're anchored in that one tech and you get that good feel from the mic, oftentimes that job for the D tackle might even be easier to make the play. But it's certainly relying on you getting hands on that guard and allowing the mic to step up, or that guard steps off of you and you're in a good position now to fill the rest of that gap.
So next, just staying in the theme of the weak front here, I'm going to go. So talking about probably the second most popular run play that we get is going to be a power run at the high school. And I know it was really popular at the university level as well. It has phased out a little bit, but it is still a play that just about every team has in their playbook, right? So the important thing here to take note of is that gaps are moving. So when gaps move to be gap sound, our linebackers have to move with it. So there's been a couple different terms that I've heard, whether it be stringing the linebackers or bumping them. But essentially, you have to understand, anyone who's running a defense has to understand, or playing linebacker, that if this guard is pulling, you have to find a way to adjust for that gap so that you don't have the will and the nose tackle in the same A gap. Right? So the easiest way, I won't say the easiest way because it's different for every team and based on your personnel, but the first way that I learned how to defend this was bumping or stringing the linebackers. So when that gap moves, the linebackers are going to move with them so that the Sam can now fill outside. The Mac is going to move to the inside of the puller, right, which is also going to take him away from this double team. And the will now is going to move and take the max gap. So basically when these gaps move, we're just going to adjust one gap over with everyone, right? Or one uncovered gap over, I should say. The other way you can do it, let's say you have a really stud nose tackle, right? And he's the best athlete on your team. He's got great eyes. He's got great feet. He's got a great takeoff. He can actually cross face so that you don't have to pull your will out, right? At the end of the day, the Mac is still going to have to adjust, and the Sam is still going to have to adjust from some kind of communication. But now the nose can cross face and play this one technique and make sure that the will is left in this gap. Now, this is probably one of the harder ways to play this, I'd say. But if you're playing in a league where there's a bunch of RPOs and everyone's taking advantage of the will, moving from bumping, then this is one way you could do it, through slanting him. Another time or later today, we'll also get into, what kind of pressures you want to run against this kind of defense. But one of the simpler things you can do to help get your linebacker alignment right and to out-leverage the blocks is to simply play a strong front, like we were talking about before. Or a weak front, sorry. So weak front, in my personal opinion, not great versus inside zone because you get a clear double team, but it works really great against power because you also force the linebackers to start with slightly better alignment, right? They don't have to move as far now as they would in a strong front. So again, we'll say the end's outside, the Sam's playing inside. Now they're going to have to go here. They're probably going to block back, some kind of pinch technique and block back because there's no will to worry about. He's going to go up to the Mac, and now this puller is going to come up to the Sam. Well, now your will only has to move about 2 steps over, your Mac only has to move 1 shuffle step, and your Sam only moves 1 shuffle step on the bump. right? So the other thing it does is it forces the center to make a really tough block back on a nose, especially, again, if this nose is a terrific athlete and he can backdoor this play. What I mean by that is rather than playing at the line of scrimmage, penetrate and chase the puller, it gives you a really good advantage, right? So it really stresses the offensive line's blocks. It forces them to be athletes in space rather than being able to really ride a double team. So this, I'd say, is one way that you could out-leverage power and put yourself in a good situation for it.
For
Now, there's
sure, and I especially think, if you're game planning for a team, often teams will have significant tendencies with their where their backfield is. So, for example, if you're getting a team that's mostly power, shifting your front away from the fullback or tight end, is one way that you can try and create that pre-snap leverage for the linebackers. I know as an O lineman, people think about the puller when they think about power, but really, that double team is the key. If you can wall off the second linebacker in the box, the job for the two guys on the front side on defense is really, really hard. If that Mike is able to work over top of the double team, you're taking away the offensive line's ability to be physical and dent the front. Now they're chasing guys at the second level. So, being in that weak front or shifting your front away from the fullback is one way you can definitely make it a lot more challenging for offenses trying to run power.
awesome. Now, some of the things you get are untraditional ways where they don't line up in two back. Maybe they bring a blocker in to block this defensive end, or they bring a guy across the formation to kick him out. Now, there's a way that you can play it where you actually try and get inside the first blocker. So let's say you're not willing to compromise shifting your front away from who their main block, or whoever's going to be blocking the end is, and you still want to have your front towards them. You can do that too. But now it's important that you're trying to force the run to bounce outside rather than stay between the tackles, right? So this is something that I would call like a spill technique. I'm sure there's other terminology out there. Wrong shouldering is another popular term for it. So let's say that this fullback is coming in. He's coming from depth now, and he's trying to block out this end. This defensive end's going to put his outside shoulder into the middle of his chest, and he's going to force the puller, rather than get up the field, to work all the way out to get that Sam linebacker. So again, this is forcing big men to be athletes in space against traditionally one of your best athletes on the field. And it's also going to force the run to bounce, right? And this is something that a lot of Canadian coaches like, because typically when teams are running power, they want to run as north-south as possible, right? When you force a run to bounce, what it does is it forces the running back to change his lane, right? Because his aiming point's going to be here. As soon as he has to bounce, he has to change his momentum, and it gives your linebackers a chance, if they get good communication on their part, to flow really fast over the top and to not worry about having to fill vertically at all, right? Now they're making a tackle in space against the running back and dealing with offensive linemen in space rather than having them come right between the tackle box at them. Now, you may not want to do this if this is the best player in the game, if this tailback here, right? Like there's a time and a place for all of these different schemes, and you have to find what works best for you. But my recommendation would be, if the running back is going to a Division I college, if he's going to be a U Sports starter someday, or he's an all-star in the league, and he's really good in space, you probably want to force him with that weak front to come up and get vertical where your linebackers have leverage. Now, if it's a big power back, first name that comes to mind, Jacob Hespler kid, Alex Harmon, if he can run the ball down your throat the whole game, it may be a good idea to force him to spill and change directions and actually be able to tackle him in space rather than between the tackles where he's the dominant workhorse.
For sure. I think the other thing too, from an O-line perspective, is when you get that double team that's working to the mic, when you're spilling that fullback or that end is staying true to the C gap and not playing in the D gap, it creates almost a natural pick for the tackle, right? So the tackle who's trying to work to the mic is flying over the top. And as the tackle, I know it's my job to seal him off. We're trying to hit this between my down block and the kick out from the fullback. As he comes over the top, oftentimes as you try and disengage from the three tech, especially if it's a three tech, if you try and disengage from that three tech, the block between the D end who's on the line of scrimmage and the fullback is kind of right on your outside hip. And that creates almost like a basketball pick for me to try and get to the mic. So it forces you to work some kind of 3-on-3 combination up front, or it forces you to really execute as that tackle and as that fullback. And, obviously anytime you can force players on the opposing team into a situation that they're not comfortable in, that it doesn't work out like the X's and O's look on the page in the playbook, that's a positive way to go. So I think that's a huge underrated thing when people talk about spilling the ball. I think people often worry about, okay, it gets on the perimeter, and that could be a huge concern, like you said, depending on who you're playing. But I think there's certain advantages there in terms of we're taking the O-line's ability to be physical and simple and just get off the ball and knock people back in front of us and taking that away from them. And I think that, especially at the high school level, that makes it really challenging for guys up front.
Really challenging. The only important piece now is if you don't get this bump communication and you spill it, you're spilling it to nothing. So it's really important that you spend time working with your linebackers, communicating when they see the puller so that they can properly leverage their gaps. I got a good clip here of Laurier, running this spill technique against Western, who is, arguably one of the best power teams in the country. So the first thing that I want to notice is what it forces the running back's track to do. As soon as he moves lateral now, it gives all the pursuing defenders who aren't exactly in the blocking scheme a chance to make a play. Like you can see Western here is actually blocking down, and they're coming in and they're trying to add in on linebackers. And they're going to leave this outside player. Well, if you spill the ball, that outside player is now at the point of attack, right? Especially versus teams who add in like that. We'll get it from the tight angle now so that you can see the exact technique. So this is what I would call a wrong shoulder. He's going to take his outside shoulder and he's going to put it to the inside shoulder of the offensive lineman. So he turns that shoulder, effectively eliminating this inside gap by putting his body in it. Right? This forces the running back now to change his track, and you can even see he loses balance there for a second. Right here when he really has to change his track. And it forces the linebackers now to work over the top. And it really stresses the offense from east-west rather than north-south.
I think it also factors into, like, what kind of players do you have? And obviously right now we're watching, university tape, so there's a lot of versatile players on the football field on both sides of the ball. But in high school, if you have a more athletic D-line, if you have an undersized D-line, maybe letting those guys play on the edge, maybe that's a better fit for your scheme, and you look at shifting the interior guys in the front to help the linebackers out. Whereas if you've got, maybe some guys in your team are playing both ways, you have a bigger, defensive line that's maybe not as dynamic in space. You definitely don't want those slower, guys that we see all the time that become three techs at the next level. You don't want those guys necessarily having to set the edge, right? Because that doesn't let them use their strength inside. So that's another factor, I think, when you're looking at how do you want to fit the run, what types of players are you fitting the run with?
Yeah.
And I've actually seen it, we've been traditionally in Cambridge, the team that I've coached with in the summer, we've traditionally spilled everything, and we've had more guys that fit into that skill set. And sometimes it's been really good for smaller guys because they could be aggressive and fast and shoot the gap. But also we've had some bigger guys that it was an easier transition for them too. So it's nice to have those options built in and understand as a coach. Okay, this is what we're defending. These are my options for how I can fit it, right? And then you and your players don't feel trapped in one system.
So one thing I want to point out too is there is a missing piece of communication here, which is not necessarily a common thing, but it's one of the things that I mentioned. When this lineman moves, gaps are moving too, right? So we have a defensive end who's supposed to be in this gap. This is a linebacker's gap right here. He's got to communicate so that they can bumper string this, and then Matt can actually fly over top and be the free hitter on this play, right? Because that communication piece is missed, even at, the highest level you'll see it. It just is enough for that tackle, who's a pretty darn good tackle, to get a piece of this MAC linebacker and actually slow him up from making a tackle in the backfield, right? So it's so important to get that communication between your linebackers, however you want to do it, and just communicate the gaps are moving. We're going to have to move with them. So next I wanted to go over, what are some advantages and disadvantages of having a D-line that penetrates versus a D-line that plays at the line of scrimmage. Because I feel like that's been an age-old argument for D-line coaches everywhere. And I've been fortunate enough to go from a coach that really stresses staying at the line of scrimmage to a coach who stresses, hey, let's dent the O-line, let's get up the field, and let's cause some issues in the backfield. So, this is my opinion on my football experience, what I feel like some of the pros and cons are, but I just wanted to bring this up. So when you're a penetrating defensive line, one of the biggest pros is you create backfield disruption. So you're going to force the running back to make a cut that he's not comfortable with and change direction behind the line of scrimmage. I believe there's a stat out there that shows the sooner that running back has to change direction, the less often he has positive yards, right? The more he can stay on his track, the more often he's at least going to make it back to the line of scrimmage, even if everything else goes well. So you're probably going to get more tackles for losses. Again, that rolls into the piece. You cut off the running back's momentum when you're a penetrating team. And it leads to a better interior pass rush because you're so used to getting up the field that you don't really have to make a read, right? You just penetrate your gap. And if it so happens to be pass, you're probably going to be in a position to pass rush a lot better than if you have a play action pass and you have to play at the line where you're trying to read, is it run, is it pass, and then try and get off the block. So one of the issues, though, is you're going to get reached if you're always penetrating, right? If you don't have that great lateral movement, you're probably going to get reached sometimes, or you're going to get knocked so far horizontally that there's going to be vertical seams that open up. So when I say a vertical seam, I just want to draw it up here. Let's say we get inside zone weak or strong, and the end does a great job on this tackle. We set an edge right here. He gets up the field, and this guard actually takes him horizontally out of the play. Now you get this colossal gap, right? So that's one of the disadvantages to penetrating, is you may actually get knocked so far wide that you may be in your gap, but you may expand the adjacent man's gap by a heck of a whole lot. And the other thing is linebackers need to match this kind of aggression. So play action may become an issue, right? RPOs, you may give a pretty clean pass read, because if the D-line is attacking this hard, the linebackers have to do it just to match. Because if this linebacker is taught to scrape and fill late, right, now it gives them a great amount of time to get up on that next level block, and it creates a lot of space for the interior D linemen and linebackers.
It really creates those vertical seams you're just talking about, right? And that's, something that I often find in summer football. You have linebackers that are thinking a lot because you're playing more advanced offenses, right? It's not like they're necessarily used to in high school. But you have D linemen that, are maybe doing the opposite, and they're just flying up the field because they're so worried about the 300-pound tackle that's across the ball. So you end up not even necessarily because that's how you're coaching it. You wind up with these D linemen that are flying, 2 or 3 yards in the backfield, and these linebackers that, what do you mean, coach, when the gaps move? I thought I just had, the A gap, right? And so you wind up with that split, and then part of your defense is playing off of penetration, and part of your defense is playing a little more conservative, and you end up, everyone says they're in their gap, but you're still giving up 6.5 yards of play on inside zone. So I think that's a great point, and something everyone's got to consider is you got to communicate that with your players. Like if your players can't tell you what it is that they're trying to do in each specific play, even beyond, I'm in the A gap, Okay, well, what are you looking at? What's my key? What am I trying to do? If I get a chance, am I trying to get 2 yards upfield, or if I get a chance, am I looking to post down that down block and stay on the line of scrimmage? I think that level of detail is often something that's lost because we're always putting out fires as coaches. But you can get two guys that think they're doing it the right way, and they are doing it the right way. They're just not doing it the same way, and you wind up with those vertical seams.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like if the whole defense isn't on the same page in terms of how to do things and not just what to do, then there's going to be issues that are probably harder to find, but are going to be pretty prominent. So now just pros and cons of staying at the line as a D-line, right? You create really simple reads for the linebackers, really simple, because you're not going to be changing gaps all the time. It lets you hang on to the guard, and it lets you occupy offensive linemen longer, which in turn give really clean reads for your linebackers. So you're probably going to get more consistent play out of them. You're probably going to get more consistent play out of your defensive line. So uh, if you have a defensive line group that's not super talented or super athletic, and you play them all at the line of scrimmage, at least, hey, they're in their gap, they're doing their job, because maybe they're not as athletic as some of the penetrating D linemen who can get back there and make plays. And you get good lateral movement. So I know at Laurier, one of the issues that we had this year was just dealing with outside zone. And one of the simple things that you can do is, you can't change the way you play for one game. You can't change everything about it. But if you're a team that traditionally is coached to stay at the line of scrimmage, you're going to do pretty well versus outside zone because you're not going to be worried about vertical movement as much as horizontal, right? And it's going to let you stay in your gaps as they move by larger distances. Some of the downsides to it, though, are you get less tackles for losses, right? Because you're not penetrating into the backfield. You're going to get a slower pass rush typically, because you're going to always get that run read first, even if you get like a short set where an offensive lineman doesn't necessarily run block, but he doesn't give a deep pass pro either. And the other thing I don't have down here are you're going to make clean reads for the running back, right? Like if you're staying at the line of scrimmage and you're just not in the right front, you're playing a one tech to the inside zone side, and you're staying at the line of scrimmage, that running back may be able to hit that B gap at 100 miles an hour, and even if you get there, you're probably going to get there late.
I think a lot of it, sometimes it depends on who you have, and
Absolutely.
I think back to my first year with the Cambridge Lions, like our D line was incredible. We had two kids, one's in Division Two, one's in Division One, and I think we had three other kids get committed. One was, a pretty big star with Timo, and they were all grade 11. I think 3 of our 4 starters were grade 11, and about 5 of our guys, like we had about 7 guys in the rotation, but I think 5 of those guys were grade 11. And for the first couple of weeks, again with consistency and everything, we were trying to, hey, we don't want to get out of our gap, we don't want to penetrate too much. We were getting counter was a tough play for us because we had 2 dominant defensive ends, but sometimes they just get a little too far up the field. And by about the 3rd week, once we got them, hey, you got to stay in your gap, but we're gonna turn you guys loose a bit, and we were playing 4-down football at the time in the OVFL, and so as a coaching staff, we just said, hey, you know what? If we don't get a tackle for a loss, right? It's hard to stop dudes with Canadian rules, 12 guys, big field, 4 downs, So we need negative plays. So we cut those guys loose, and once our backers kind of got up to speed with it, we were really good in the front 7, and we gave up some plays, but like you said, the pros outweighed the cons because we were getting tackles for a loss. We were getting, we wouldn't fit counter right, but we had one guy blow up 2 pullers, and we were able to make the play. And so we were able to coach it more that way of, hey, let's get off the ball. You need to stay in your gap. It's a non-negotiable, but you need to get, it's okay for you guys to be a little more aggressive and get up the field. And that really helped us, and I think, 2 years later, we have a totally different group. Again, another group of young guys, grade 11, it was a good, strong group, but they were just better fundamentally when they stayed on the line of scrimmage. And for them, whatever the difference was, we had some guys in that group that have gone on to U Sports now, and it just fit them better, right?
Yeah.
Like we didn't make as many tackles for loss with that D line, but our run fits were incredible. And we had a younger group of linebackers at the time, so it helped us that their job was a little simpler. So two totally different D lines with different kids, and I think in both years we played the run really well. But again, it's just as long as the makeup of what you're doing matches what everyone else is doing, right?
Yeah.
You can't say to your super athletic three tech, hey, you go be a penetrator, and your bigger size eater say, hey, you just stay in the line of scrimmage, because you're not going to get the best out of both guys in that case, right? So
And you might create some inconsistent play for the linebackers, which I think is really tough, especially if one side, you're penetrating and getting up the line, there's these vertical seams, but then your backside linebacker is playing really slow and opening up there might be a cutback lane, but he's got to go fill front side because you have these vertical seams. Now it gets tough to maintain gaps. So one other point that I wanted to make is when you're staying at the line of scrimmage, typically you don't dent the offensive line as much. So when I say dent the offensive line, I mean you're not knocking bodies back. So I got two clips that I want to show. One of Guelph, one of Laurier, because I find that, being in both systems now in different roles, there is a different way that it's coached, right? At Guelph, we tended to be, let's stay at the line of scrimmage, let's stay gap sound. At Laurier, it's like, yeah, we want to stay gap sound, but, Sam Achimpong, he may do his thing. So let him, if he wants to penetrate and make a play, or Trayvon James wants to dent and pancake an offensive lineman, let that kind of stuff happen, because you can't always change how a player plays to fit the system. Sometimes you got to let the system fit the players,
for
right?
sure.
So I'm going to pull up, benefits of penetrating. This is the clip right here. So again, I think they had 4 all-stars on this offensive line group, right? If I'm not mistaken, from this year. But you're going to see the benefit to having a penetrating defensive line, right? I only have one, right? You can see I want to draw attention to Sam Achimpong here. He's going to penetrate, and he's going to cut off this running back's initial track, right? He stays in his gap, but he knocks the offensive lineman back about 2 yards. Now, the really big benefit is what we have here. So Trayvon James is going to come, and he's actually going to try and penetrate so hard that if anything gets in his way, moving laterally, he has so much forward momentum that he's going to end up knocking them back, right? And this is a phenomenal offensive line group that they're going against. But when you're coming off the ball hard with the intention of penetrating, it opens up opportunities to knock players back like that. So really, really good. Again, we're in a really good front for fitting inside zone, which definitely helps. We're playing through the guards. It makes the climbs a little more difficult, squeezes the gaps down, as I touched on earlier. But you can just see his initial get off is what creates the opportunity for him to get that kind of dent. Same thing with Sam here. Now, if Sam gets pancaked, which is going to happen to the best of us, but it's the initial dent that affects the running back. And now, as soon as the running back gets this ball, he knows he has to cut back, right? Unfortunately for him, Trayvon's already pancaked this guard here right in his pass, so that makes it difficult. You're going to have Greg Corfield here. You can see he moves laterally to stay in his gap with his first step rather than attack the gap and try and penetrate, but it lets him be in full control of the guard, right? Now he can move laterally, horizontally across and make the tackle, right? I want to draw attention now. You get Jeremy Kapolinski here. He ends up anchoring his gap pretty well. Again, they're staying really gap sound. They're making really clear reads for the linebackers, right? This is the advantage to this kind of defense. They know where they have to foot on the fullback, right? They know where their gaps are, and nothing's changing on them. It lets the linebackers play really fast. It gives you a consistent play, but some of the downsides are you're not getting that same TFL, right? You may let up a gain of 1 or 2 yards. But again, it's like what kind of athletes does your team have? How do you want the linebackers to be coached? And what do you think is the best fit for you with that particular team? So I wanted to go over, like, I kind of did touch on it already, why you take on pullers with an inside shoulder versus an outside shoulder, or the other way around, you know. So one of the things, why force them vertical? Well, maybe you have a 150-pound tailback that you're going against, right? And your linebacker is 220 pounds, right? That may be a good time to post up pullers. So when I say post up pullers, I mean, let's say this guy comes and he pulls around the defensive end. Now he's going to get on his outside shoulder and try and squeeze this gap down so the linebackers can fill vertically, right? So why you'd want to force them vertical, you're playing a lighter tailback who's got really good moves in space that you're probably not confident playing against in space, right? I know there's years ago, my high school, which had a lot of success, was playing I want to say Lakeshore Catholic, when they had a whole bunch of stud players. And they said they spent all week worrying about, hey, we have to do drills because we can't let this guy get outside, right? So if you're playing a team like that, where you're playing, you know, the number one scat back in the country or the province or even the city, maybe you want to force them vertical and reduce the area of space where he can make cuts in the open field. And then, you know, what I touched on earlier, why force them to bounce? You want to force them to bounce if you get a big running back who doesn't have a great change of direction, or maybe your D-line is just a bigger D-line that can fit those inside gaps really well, and you don't want your 250-pound DN to play contain against a running back. And then you have to understand, like, where is your help coming from, right? Do you teach your DBs to play man coverage, and are they going to be run off the whole game? Because if they're going to be run off the whole game and you spill the ball, now it's like, well, that 15-yard one-on-one turns to a 35 yards of space one-on-one with the linebacker. Maybe that's not the best fit for you at the time, right? If you're playing cover 3 hold the whole time and you have your halves low and you have really good run support, then it makes sense. Like, hey, let's spill the ball, because not only do we have our linebackers coming, but we got a slot back trying to block a half who's a pretty good ball player, right? So there's a lot of things to take into account when you're trying to weigh, like, do we want to force them to bounce, or do we want to force to box it and force it back inside?
Thanks for watching episode 1 of All Things Even Front with Guest Coach Charlie Taggart. Stay tuned for episode 2 coming later this week on using the exchange principle to fit the run.